Good afternoon, Sean.
Good afternoon, Ben. Looking very smart, I have to say today.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I thought we'd do something different today.
Uh-oh.
So, last week we covered what I think you called the ghost army, which was a whole load of make-believe things that have thrown Putin into thinking he got successes and actually hadn't. And now we've got the convict army, which is finding a different source for soldiers. Tell us what's going on.
Well, this war of attrition that's going on at the moment means that a lot of soldiers are becoming casualties, loads are losing their lives. And of course, both Russia and Ukraine are trying to sustain the fight. But to put some sort of context in, the Russia is on the front foot at the moment of a range of the front line. They're exploiting a window of opportunity because NATO weapons hadn't been arriving. They are now arriving, but there's still a shortfall. But you remember Bakhmut, and at the height of that, the battle was called the bloodiest since the Second World War. Russia was losing just under 1,000 soldiers a day. Reports suggest at the moment that for the last couple of months, Russia's been losing 1,200 a day. So it's worse than the bloodiest battle of World War II. And that's just not a sustainable level of casualties. Now, Russia has tried, it has an annual draft for its conscripts, but there's a lot of reports that hundreds of thousands of wealthy young men are fleeing Russia.
How do they do that? I mean,
it's a big country.
Get on a plane and...
Well, they're doing a lot to try and stop it at the moment, but by all accounts, when a big country with land borders, it's not that difficult to get through them. And therefore, how do you... Russia does not want to do another round of mobilization. In other words, that's right, we need to... Because that sends a really powerful message to the nation that it's not really working. It'd be very unpopular. So Russia has taken to recruiting convicts. You'll remember Yevgeny Prigozhin for the Wagner Group recruited something like 48,000 during his tenure, particularly around Bakhmut. They lost 17,000, got killed. So Russia has continued that theme. Now, apparently, I know it's a delicate subject, but in this country, the prisons are bulging and we're just letting some of the prisoners go, apparently, to try to ease the burden. Well, Russian prisons, apparently, before the war, had nearly 500,000 prisoners. That total has dropped by 150,000. Basically, it's dropped by a third since the start of the war because Russia's just been recruiting them into the army.
So they go in and offer them freedom after service or something?
Yeah, so it was a full pardon if they did 6 months service on the front line. And that's, now in the early days with Prigozhin and the bloody battles, not too many seem to be surviving to the end of that tenure. But apparently now there's a lot more surviving. And you've now got murderers and rapists and all sorts back on the streets of Russia. And that's causing a massive problem for Russia. So what they've done is they've changed the rules. They've now said if you're going to recruit prisoners, they have to stay fighting until the end of the war. So whatever that means, but they're not going to be released after 6 months. So now the problem with these convicts, I think, is that reports suggest they're getting about 10 days training. I'm not sure how much you can do in 10 days, apart from teach them which end of the gun's the right direction, point and whatever. But they're not going to get all the formal training about law of armed conflict, Geneva Convention. There'll be an absolute nightmare disciplinary-wise to manage because they don't have any rank, but they won't respect the officers or the senior NCOs because, frankly, they've faced a lot worse. And so one of the problems of having sort of a convict army is just that you end up with an increasing number of atrocities along the way. But I was just alarmed that some of the figures come out this week about a third of the Russian prison population it's dropped, and most of them seem to have been recruited into the Russian armed forces.
So you come from 20 hours slavery a day in the Siberian mines to the front line, which is only a hop, skip and a jump from freedom as well. So I wonder whether they're leaking some that way as well as
Well, there were a lot of reports. One of the things that I was fascinated when Wagner was in control, Yevgeny Prigozhin was, by all accounts, pretty brutal and had a number of his henchmen around. And there's some videos out on the internet that show him recruiting allegedly prisoners. And he only has 3 rules, I think. But one of those rules is, if you run away, you get shot. There's no second chances here. You're there to fight, otherwise you get shot. And I would imagine under that regime, it was pretty brutal. Now that Wagner's no longer running the show, and actually it's more under conventional army command and control, how does that work? How you've got these murderers, rapists, or whatever, with a gun in their hands, how do you force them to continue fighting? I just don't know. And again, it just creates a really difficult... Now, most of the reports coming back are suggesting that they're just thrown into the front line to be cannon fodder.
Yeah.
I know that sounds horrible, but...
Give them a gun. And
it's not highly coordinated. You're not coordinating fires, tanks, movement on the ground. It's just go and take that. And accept you have horrendous casualties.
Yeah, because if the worry is they eventually end up on the streets and commit crimes, heinous ones, as you've described, it doesn't really matter whether that happens in 6 months or 3 years in terms of the end of the battle. It's still going to happen, unless, of course, they reckon that most of them are going to get killed.
Yeah, and that's the subtext of all of this, is how do you solve that problem?
Extend the war.
Well, it's also not just that, but the Russians have barricade forces. So they very famously have a series of forces behind their front line, and their only job is if you turn around and come back, you're going to get shot. Yeah.
But it all sounds pretty brutal. Of course, we're talking about crimes back in Russia. And I think you implied crimes on the battlefield as well.
In the early stages of this war, when the Russians cleared out Bucha and some of the other places, they discovered some pretty horrendous war crimes that had been conducted. And I think, now, please don't get me wrong, I'm a scholar of World War II. If you've watched, I watched Saving Private Ryan the other day again. And
it's a long film.
Yeah, but those machine gun nests onto the beach.
Yeah.
If you watched a load of your guys getting killed by a guy behind a machine gun, when you finally get up there, I know what you should do according to the law of armed conflict, but I also know that every sinew in your body is going to be going, I'm afraid, mate, you've had it.
Yeah.
You're not going to take people like that surrender. And I'm not suggesting that's right. I'm just saying that the horrors of war, it's very difficult for people to understand them from the privacy of their own living room. The problem is now you manifest that without having the training, because today in our militaries we have a hell of a lot of training around
the law. Can't do.
Yeah, what you kind of can't do, because actually you could win the battle but lose the war purely because you don't subscribe to the... Whereas that's not happening on the front line in Russia.
Yeah, so we have successfully, generally painted Putin as the bad guy. So this is the sort of thing you'd expect him to do: raid prisons, put them on the front line, irrespective of what goes on in the battle, irrespective of what goes on back home when they're on the streets running amok. But I gather, actually, funny old thing, Ukraine is doing the same thing.
Yeah, you have to ferret around a bit in the news, but actually there's a lot of reports now that Ukraine, because they're facing a similar sort of challenge with a number of soldiers, that there's reports that they're trying to recruit up to 20,000 prisoners. And inevitably, trying to get to the bottom of the actual facts here is often quite difficult. But I was trying to find out whether or not they are simply looking at those people who've been locked up for pilfering or for stealing or whatever. And apparently one of the caveats was that as long as you can have murdered somebody, but not 2 people. If you've murdered 2 people, they won't release you. I just couldn't quite get my head around that. Yeah. But the fact is that, they're also pursuing a similar line. And the sadness is that if they give them the right training, and I hope that happens, then you'll avoid what's happening with Russia. My concern is that Ukrainian society will care less about the convicts, will care less if they go to their death. And at the moment, there's an urgent need for soldiers on the front line. And therefore, you can feel everything pointing towards just get them on the front line, give them a gun, play their part. And I think two things, one of which is they're more likely to lose their life. But secondly, the danger is we're going to see an increase in this sort of brutality, some travesty of war. I just think that's inevitable.
Yeah. Well, I've got one final question for you.
Oh.
So you mentioned 1,200 Russian soldiers dying every day.
Casualties. So not all of them are dying.
Okay. In a way, although you'd sooner be a casualty, depending on your injuries, than actually dying, but actually casualties are worse in one way, because A, they take a lot more effort to look after, and secondly, if they're bad, they finish fighting, they go back home, and then they're a living emblem of what's been going on in Ukraine from a Russian point of view. That's not good. 1,200 a day, though, that's quite a lot each year. I don't know, 400,000, almost 1 million over 2 years and a bit. That's probably, I don't know, I haven't done the sums, but that's like every street in Russia has got one. Hiding this from the Russian people is tricky. And we've talked before about how good Putin was at doing it. It's not so easy now, is it?
It isn't, because it's one thing controlling the internet. It's one thing controlling the television and the narrative. But they talk about, Mother Russia. They talk about the families. They're the people who talk. And there's an increasing number of families who know that their sons are either have not come home or have come home badly injured. And we understand this post-traumatic stress disorder thing better now. But do you think Russia's going to be well equipped to deal with, some of these people going back? They would have seen horrible things, would have done horrible things. And it's a sad reality, picking up your point. I mean, it's a horrible thing to talk about, but a lot of the weapons on the battlefield, you're absolutely right. If you kill somebody, they can be left to one side. If you injure them, it takes a lot more effort to look after them, because it's your comrade, it's your mate. You've got to get him back. So it diverts people away from fighting. So a lot of weapons...
And other resources. A
lot of weapons, particularly mines, are deliberately designed not to kill you. They're designed to maim you, because then it creates a more difficult problem to manage. And it's just... It's horrible talking about it, but it's the reality of what happens in a grinding war of attrition. And as you say, there's going to be a lot of these going back to Russia. Not only does that create a financial burden and a long-term burden, because many of these might not be able to work again, so you create a very imbalanced society. But gradually, more and more of these, casualties go home, and there's an increasing disconnect then between the positive story coming out from Putin and his leadership.
It's in their street, it's in their neighbourhood, it's in their family. Hard to keep the wraps on that.
No, very hard.
And, So, sure, I've spoken a number of times about these damn awful things called glide bombs. So you take a bomb, you add some fins at the back, some intelligence, you let it go from behind your own lines in your own territory, out of harm's way. It travels quite a long way. How long?
Well, it depends how high you load and how fast you are, but up to 50 kilometres away.
50 kilometres, that's quite a long way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not, intensely accurate, but it lands on the battlefields of your opponents and does a lot of damage. Linked to that, because one way of getting rid of those is to put a plane up and challenge the other plane that's launching it, is I gather we've got more news coming in on the F-16s.
So you're absolutely right. The interesting thing about the news in the F-16s, going straight to the point, is that there's a lot of media coverage that says F-16s are about to arrive in Ukraine. And the way that conversation is posed sounds like that's the answer to the Maiden's Prayer, that they'll arrive and suddenly Russia will be on the back foot. And you go, right, let's unpick that a bit. Why would you announce they were coming in? I mean, eventually you're going to see them over the battlefield. But, Russia has been pounding away at Ukraine airfields these last few weeks. They've claimed they've destroyed 5, I think, of the Su-27s on the ground just in July alone. Whether that's true or not, whether it's part of this ghost army or whatever, we don't know. But what President Zelensky has said is that one of the biggest threats that his forces face at the moment is these glide bombs. And you go, hey, Why is that? And part of that is because Russia can launch them from the safety of Russian airspace.
And a lot of them.
And they're pretty accurate as well. And some of them have been pretty big, so they cause carnage on the ground. You don't see them coming, you can't stop them. So the way to stop them is to shoot the aircraft down, or at least threaten it, so that it goes, it can't, because to do 40 kilometers, it's got to be very high and fairly fast, which is pretty vulnerable. As a military guy,
you're exposed.
But they obviously think they'll be safe up there. So by bringing the F-16s in, I think part of one of their principal challenges will be to try to address this threat. So the really interesting question is how? Because these Russian aircraft are inside Russian airspace. So they're well protected. They're all sorts of surface-to-air missiles and air defense systems, because Russia will have all of those at its border anyway. So how are the F-16 is going to do it? Now, one of the ways they do it is using what's called an AMRAAM missile, Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile. The 120, I think it's called, is most widely used, but it depends which model they get. The earlier models could go about 30 miles. The later models can go up to 100 miles.
It's an air-to-air missile.
Air-to-air missile. And they're pretty deadly because, without getting into the geekery here, originally, if I was shooting you, I would have to have my radar illuminating your aircraft, and then a missile would go, okay, I've got that signal, and then it would start to transmit a signal, so it would take over identifying you, and then it would home in on the radar return. Of course, inevitably, you would develop different tactics. So you could actually put chaff out, or you could have electronic means to deceive the radar. And the subsequent generations of missiles have basically got smarter and smarter about how to stop being deceived and also go further and further. So part of this will America let Ukraine have long-range versions of this missile?
And who's going to pilot the planes?
Well, that's the great question, because at the moment Ukraine has a number of pilots, but they're of course trained in the old Soviet-style aircraft, and you might be up, down, left, right, faster, slower will probably be much the same in any aeroplane, but all of these, the technology that's in there will be completely different. They've been doing some training, but bluntly. So Ukraine needs quantity of aircraft. They've asked for, I think it's 130 F-16s.
Really?
Well, that's 4 squadrons plus a few spares. They think that's how many they need to put a credible threat against Russia. I think they've been offered up to 85 so far. So they're probably going to get the aircraft, and then there's the spares and the logistics support and the engineers to train, whatever. But they don't have the pilots. And although they've been training some of them, they're going to be drip feeding in. There's been reports that they might have a squadron's worth of pilots trained by the end of this year. One of the advantages is that, generally speaking, these aircraft will be operating over Ukrainian territory. So as you remember in sort of Battle of Britain, we were really short of pilots. We had lots of aircraft. And if our aircraft was shot down, the pilots bailed out. They landed on British territory.
Next day they're up again.
Dusted down, given a pint, sent back to their squadron, get back in, off you go again. So the Ukrainians, if they have plenty of aircraft and they use the ejection seat and they're not blown up as the aircraft shot down, it might be that they're able to be a bit more resilient, because obviously the Russian pilots are going to be over enemy territory.
I think Bagwell actually told us what the conversion training was like in terms of time, didn't he?
He did, and the trouble is, if you've got a guy who is very experienced on a former Russian fighter jet, so he knows how radars work, he knows the principle, he's got the awareness of how you fight three-dimensional chess, how you use this information, how you lead people around. If you've got all that, they reckon it was sort of 3 to 6 months to be able to become competent and capable on an F-16. My experience of the front line is you don't have many of those people who have all that experience. They tend to be the tip of the sword, but you've got loads of people who have, Yes, they're combat ready on a fast jet, but that, we've said before, is a bit like a 17-year-old just passed his test. Yes, he's allowed out onto the roads, but he's a danger to shipping.
Yeah.
So part of the issue is not just about being competent at flying, it's about being competent enough to go to war and also be able to operate as a package of aircraft. Because there's some really clever tricks that you can do in the air. So, for example, I don't know if they're going to have data link. Why is that important? If I'm in my F-16 and you're in your Russian jet and I identify you, you know how far I am away. You know how long range missile I've got. So if you know I'm over 100 miles away, you don't do much about it. If I've got a data link that now data links your position to one of my F-16 colleagues who's not 100 miles away, but is 50 miles away, but over there, he's now got the information of where you are and he can launch a missile at you without you knowing that he's there.
Because he hasn't had to use his own...
radar. So there's all sorts of really clever techniques that can be used. And this is just Janet and John stuff. There's a lot more techniques available. But they take time to learn. They take time to, hours and hours in a simulator, hours and hours of working out, because nothing ever quite goes according to plan when you're actually up there. So in short, will the F-16s arrive shortly? Maybe. Will they arrive in sufficient numbers to make a big difference? No. Will they cause the Russian pilots to think twice? Because there will be F-16 radars lighting up the Russian fighters. Will that cause them to go, oh, and catch their breath a bit? Maybe. Can't do it twice. but it may well, therefore, deter some of the actions.
So it is a significant development. It's going to take some time for it to build up into the sort of military capability that Ukraine would ideally want. And also, it's going to have to start from scratch with people. Now, how long was your training?
Well, about 3.5 years from scratch to... And that, again, I reiterate, that's just to be combat ready on a squadron.
Yeah.
That's the 17-year-old who's just passed his test.
Yeah.
It's really another 3 years on top of that before you are a master of your domain. So it's 6 years.
5 to 6 years.
It's a long time. But no, it's an interesting development. But and I think the other thing we're going to probably cover at some stage is when, not if, the first of them are shot down or destroyed on the ground, because these are 50 million pounds worth of aircraft, and they will be targeted by the Russians. They will be using satellites, long-range missiles, sensors, spies, whatever they can to target these missiles, to target these aircraft.
The 75th anniversary of NATO has happened. We wondered whether, quite frankly, it was going to be a bit of a distraction because of Biden there. People were watching Biden. How was he going to be doing? But apparently that didn't happen. That sort of went smoothly. I was a bit concerned that generally these things were a bit of a damp squib. Nothing actually gets achieved. This is a sort of big moment in the world, so we thought maybe that would focus people's minds. A lot of other things happening around it. What, in your assessment, Sean, what was the outcome?
As you say, I genuinely was concerned that despite this, there's a war raging in Europe at the moment, new members joining NATO. How do you assimilate them? How do you make NATO credible? How do you get defence spending up from those countries, still half of NATO that's not spending their money correctly? How do you support Ukraine long term? There's some really pithy issues to deal with. But actually, President Biden, there were a couple of gaffes, but big handfuls. That it wasn't the distraction that it might have been. I think a couple of things that did come out from it, from my perspective, there's always a bit of more money and a bit more. But Sir Keir Starmer announced that Storm Shadow missiles, our long-range missiles, could be used against Russian targets, which got me scratching my head a bit because I sort of went, hang on a minute, Lord Cameron already announced that a couple of weeks ago. But actually, it was probably worth hearing from the new Prime Minister because is there continuity? And that's a really good example of continuity. It provoked a bit of reaction from the Russians as well. Why was it done there? It was almost certainly done to get the Americans, because they've still got limits on what they'll let Ukraine use their weapons for. with Ukraine on the back foot at the moment on the front line, the last thing they need is limitations. So almost certainly Sir Keir Starmer was trying to do something to help that. But I think the other thing that came out that caught my attention was that we've been doing this podcast for some time. I've been doing the Sky work for a couple of years. And the prevailing view has been Trump is not going to make it to the White House, but Biden will make it. That narrative over the last few weeks has been shifting markedly. And there was a lot of conversation in the margins here about, what's going to happen if President Trump actually does take the next presidency? What does that mean for NATO, particularly? What does that mean for the support for Ukraine? And then...
Blow me down.
Somebody tries to assassinate President Trump, clips his ear, and it's some amazing footage doing around. But I was left, it's all been covered, in loads of places. But the one thing I was left was that I'd been shot at a few times, not hit, but he's been hit and he's a civilian. He's not been to war. How do you think this will have affected him?
Well, I'll come on to that. I've got a view, and I also watched him immediately afterwards, and also as he came into his own convention, which I thought was actually quite interesting. But I think this is the news of the century. I mean, I think it's just captivated people actually on both sides. The coverage in some of the mainstream media has been absolutely laughable. My favourite one is Secret Service agents helped President Trump off the stage after he fell. That was the headlines. Another one was similar, but we heard some popping from somewhere. Obviously, some newspapers do not want to encapsulate that moment and give Trump any sort of hero credit, so they downplayed it. I thought that was funny. I think the bullet was coming like this, and would have taken the back of his head off. In that, how long did it take? Half a second to go from...
Well, it was about 150 metres away. Yeah. If you do the maths, I think it's about half a second time of flight.
Pulls the trigger, half a second later, the bullet's here. In that half second, he turns his head, probably to look at a teleprompter, and the bullet clips his ear. That's pretty scary. I think that's changed. At least temporarily, that's changed a lot. How would he respond? So my theory about a massive instant trauma, so you're involved in something where your life is threatened, people, to simplify it, respond in two ways. The first way is the sense of the risk that they've taken and the potential for them to have lost their life or been severely injured causes them to shrink into themselves, and they think about their own survival. That's their first instinct, to the extent where they won't necessarily help anybody else around them because they're too focused on just staying alive or getting out, or, so bomb blasts on trains and buses and so on. People have experienced this. The other side of that immediate effect is people are empowered for some reason, and it makes them stronger. And who knows what sort of character falls into those two. What we saw from Trump was once he got back up, he stood up, he was visible. Only 2 seconds earlier, he was being shot at. He stood up and he had no idea where it came from, whether the shooter had been shot or what. He stood up, he was now visible again. I'm not congratulating him for it, but it is quite an unusual response. And then he fist pumped the air 3 times. Now, only his instinct was operating. There was this is not planned, So that's the immediate thing, and I think generally that falls into those two camps. The longer one, and then the very long one. The longer one is much more interesting, which is that a lot of people become more sensitive to things and people, much more thoughtful, slightly more reserved, less pompous. And there's loads of reasons for that. I don't know what's going to happen to Trump, but I think there's 2 slight bits of evidence. If you watch Trump arrive at his conference a couple of days ago, he's not the big, bold, arms waving guy. He looks much more thoughtful, much calmer, slightly nervous. I mean, I don't want to overdo the term. He looked strong, but he looked to me a slightly different man. I'm not saying it's worse or better. The second thing, and this could be all politics. That's definitely not politics. I think we saw the man, as he is. But of course, he's changed he had some speeches prepared, and they're the normal sort of punchy, very punchy, go for the jugular things. I haven't seen one, but I heard the plan. He's toned it all down. He's now talking about unity and getting on with people and so on. And that personalisation that wells up inside you after something so big is quite common. Whether that's actually happened to Donald Trump, whether his skin is thin enough for that to get through, who knows? If somebody said to me, it's all politics, I'd believe them. There's a much, much longer thing, which is PTSD. Now, if you don't deal with it then, if I've done it, it's fine. Let's get on. But if you actually haven't done it, then of course that can come out much later.
And that's what I was, because obviously...
That's quite a long answer, sorry.
No, but I'm fascinated because as a military guy, I look at this completely differently. You're shot at in operation environments, you deal with people who have been shot, and it's par for the course. I wouldn't trivialise it, but you've just got to get on with it. Whereas this, for him, wouldn't have been expecting it. And at the time, probably didn't hurt that much. It was all a bit of shock and everything happens. But when you're back on your own in bed that night, reflecting how close that was, it wasn't an accident, somebody intended to kill you and got that close to doing it. Whether that's one of those life
big moments.
Yeah. And I wouldn't want to conjecture how it changes people, but I'd just be fascinated to see whether that might have an impact on him, because it's one thing having all the rhetoric and feeling impervious, say whatever you like, lie, taunt, chide, whatever. But suddenly, when there is a repercussion for that, now we don't know that this is linked to political. But I would imagine that there's a moment of reflection in there that just says, hang on a minute, how am I going to attack from here?
Well, it's not necessarily conscious either. You may not even be aware that it's happening. And I as you know, I was on the 7/7 bombings in the next carriage down there in a tube. It was pretty horrendous. I was thinking as we were talking, well, how did it affect me? I'll probably leave it to others to try and assess it. But these things definitely, change people. So it will be very interesting to see how he now handles it. Apart from anything else, from a practical point of view, he's got to stand up on podium after podium. What are they going to do? Surround him with a bulletproof glass shield, which of course has been done lots, or whatever. Will he be less bold than he was? So that will be fascinating. In terms of your thing about it's much more likely now Trump will win. It was going that way anyway, and secondly, we got this big event. Boris has been over there. Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, has been over there and was asking Trump to support Ukraine. Now, what was his answer? His answer was very, very interesting. He said, I will protect democracy. He didn't actually give away his intentions. So I think he's kept the suspense about the real intentions. And his vice president, who's just announced, is also a pretty bullish sort of guy. So it will be fascinating to see. I'm not sure Boris got what he wanted.
No, but there's some interesting spin-offs to this, and we don't have time in here. But I think one of them was listening to some of our own politicians. So after Trump, it was attempted assassination. If you go to Westminster Tube Station opposite the House of Parliament, you'll regularly see MPs just coming and going because they walk out of the House of Parliament and they're immediately in the crowd. Yeah. Now, okay, we don't have quite the same availability of guns in this country, but my goodness, if knives, anything else, we have ready access to our politicians. I think that's one of the strengths of our democracy, but I have no doubt that events like this, particularly we've just been through an election where it was quite acerbic, it was quite personal, it was quite dramatic, that I do wonder how long we'll be able to preserve that level of freedom in this country.
Quite, that's a good point, Sean. Yeah. So, Sean, we have a new government in the UK. The Labour Party won with a massive landslide. They've now had to basically do all their washing up. What's the future going to look like? A whole set of clean clothes. One aspect of that is the SDSR. Is it Security, Strategic Defence and Security Review? Presumably no, or is it just defence?
It's just been announced as just defence,
Okay.
But whether or not it will be security, wait to see.
So how do the politicians? What are their options when they think about this and think about the tactics? What are their options as they actually go into it?
You and I are both old enough now to have seen a few of these through, and at the risk of sounding gloriously simplistic, what they're meant to be about is a review of the global landscape, the threats that are out there, Britain's place in the world, and what we need to do what's the number one priority of any government, which is the protection of our people. What do we need to do, and how much is that going to cost? And that's what the Defence Review bluntly is about. What are the threats facing our nation? What capabilities does our nation need to ensure the safety, not today, not tomorrow, but for the next 10 years and beyond? What's the cost of that? Gulp. That's what defence reviews are meant to be. And that's what all the political language is about. Unfortunately, history suggests that the other way of doing them is actually behind closed doors saying, the answer is 2.5%. Here's how much money. What can we do for that amount of money?
Yeah.
So that, I mean, the classic term, vision without funding is hallucination. It doesn't matter what you want to do. If you haven't got the money to do it, what's the point in creating all of these dreams about where the defence should go? The language is all pointing towards the former. What do we need to protect ourselves in the future world? My scepticism is that actually the answer is 2.5%. Now fill in the gaps in between. And that really worries me.
So it's a bit like the politicians saying to the military, go off and design our new defence capability, and they come back with the answer and they go, no, I don't quite like it, Okay, we'll go back and do another one. They come back second time, then third time. Then in the end, the defence guys go, well, I'll tell you what, you just do it because you seem to have an idea what you want. It's that type of thing.
Yeah, because, certainly each time I've seen the iteration of this, if you only left it to the military, and it's not being left to the military, but if you only left it to the military, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, the British Army would all want more tanks, more ships, more aeroplanes. And bluntly, dealing with a threat like Russia, you could deal with it using the Air Force, you could deal with just with the Army, you could do it just with the Navy. I'm being flippant for effect, but actually, what's the right blend of those three services to create the most cost-effective capability? And that can't be done by each of the services. That has to be a blend. And therefore, this particular defence review, John Healey announced, I was privileged enough to get a bit of a briefing directly from John Healey.
And we want this to be Britain's defence review, unlike the previous defence reviews we've seen. So the reviewers will brief and consult and invite contributions from other political parties, from the armed forces, from civilians involved in defence right across the piece, including industry and academia.
He's appointed Lord Robertson to run it. He was a former Secretary NATO. He's also done one of the defence reviews back in 1998, so he knows how the process works. He's got General Richard Barrons, who's a former four-star Army chief, helping him. And Fiona Hill, that's a US military advisor. I can only assume that's because with America as being our key strategic partner, playing off that relationship, I think, will be the challenge. I think, unfortunately, two things that worry me, one of which is it'll take at least a year to do this review and then at least a year to implement it. 2 years. Do we have 2 years at the moment? And sceptically, from a political perspective, you're halfway towards the next general election by then. So you're just buying yourself some time. And the other thing that slightly concerns me is that I'm a veteran of the Cold War, where we were spending 4, 5, 6% of GDP at times, it feels like we've returned to that more dangerous world, that this sabbatical, 30 years of peace dividend that we've enjoyed was great, but it's over. And we used to have, at Barkston Heath, just down the road from where I was training, we had big Bloodhound missile systems that were ready to point at the enemy. We don't have any of that stuff today. We don't feel protected in the way that we were in the Cold War. And it feels like that seems to be the direction of travel that we really should be going. And that may end up with a big bill. And the question then is, which you and I discuss a little bit offline, is, as a military guy, I'd be saying, surely if that's the number one priority, you've got to spend money on that and take difficult choices elsewhere. Whereas there's a different view, isn't there?
Well, I think for me, it all boils down to one thing. And that one thing is, what is the first objective of every politician?
Get re-elected.
Get re-elected. And unless bombs are landing in your street, it's generally quite hard to get votes from defence. What votes do you get? I mean, everybody will say we want to support Ukraine, or a lot of people will. But when it's, well, we're going to do that, but when you get to the end of the month, we're going to have to cut your social security. Well, I don't like that. So I think, yeah, you could argue the ultimate role of the government is the protection of its own nation and its own borders. But actually, when you've got up to 10 million people economically inactive, the social security bill is vast. And this is about people getting through to the end of the month without stealing something from next month to pay for a few days of fuel or food. So I think it's quite tricky for the Labour Party to work out how to handle that, because the more money they spend on defence doesn't mean more votes. And they want to go into the next election. You've said it's starting to butt up against the beginning of the campaigning season. Well, they might have been better off spending that money on something else, which will actually get votes from. So for the Labour Party, it's going to be tricky, actually.
It is, and I do wonder. I think it's one of the things we're going to touch on a fair bit over the coming year. I think because I think there'll be a lot of political focus on trying to do small steps. How can we do stuff to try to demonstrate that we're taking defence seriously while still delivering on all these other things? And I get that. The trouble is, history shows that if you're not well prepared for a conflict, then you invite a conflict. The great thing about being strong and having a robust military capability is you deter a potential adversary because they know you're ready. If they know you're not ready, then actually it encourages people to have a go.
Yes, that's true. And I wonder, there's quite a few steps between Russia and the UK, other countries. And being an island as well, I wonder whether people are always tempted to feel we're a lot safer than everybody else.
Yeah, and you're playing back now to the late 1930s, aren't you? Which was it won't be us, we'll appease, Hitler. And then, sure enough, the war came to our shores and it became a lot more difficult to deal with it. A lot of historians suggest that if we dealt with it a lot earlier, it would have been a lot easier to sort out. We didn't, and as a result of not doing that, it became incredibly painful, and millions and millions, tens of millions of lives were lost as a result.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is everybody in the whole Labour Party, the extreme left, the middle left, the sort of centre ground, of which there's, a complete spectrum, as there is in probably most parties, but they all kept quiet. They all played the line. They didn't really answer any question. They were coached. I mean, as a campaigner, I thought it was absolutely brilliant from that point of view. They never really answered any question directly because they didn't need to. It was clear they were going to win. Now they've won, all those other factions will come out of the woodwork. And of course, the heart of the left in the Labour Party is anti-war, significant anti-war. And don't forget, in both of Corbyn's elections as Labour leader, which he lost, he got many, many more votes, actual votes, than Keir Starmer did in winning. So he's got a power base, both in the country and in the party. This will come out as well.
No, I agree.
Keir Starmer's going to have to manage all of that.
No, I think it's, and that's why we're going to cover it, because I think, again, it's terms like anti-war. I'm an ex-military guy. I'm absolutely anti-war.
Yeah, sure.
I've seen the impact.
Yeah.
Of what war
you're
does.
sort of supporting defending yourself, though.
No, people say, "Oh, you're a military." Some of the trolls out there call us warmongers. And you go, really? If you've ever served in the military and been on operations, you're quite the opposite. The reason you're in the military is because you stand proud on the line and you are a credible deterrent to our nation's enemies. You failed if you actually have to go and fight, because bluntly, you've not deterred them well enough. And that's why we have a professional armed forces that are there to be at the tip of the sword, to be a credible deterrent against our nation's enemies. And the danger is, none of us are pro-war, but war has a horrible habit of coming to your door. And if you're not ready for it, you pay a much higher price for it. And I think that's, there's a lovely quote, isn't there? People who don't study history are destined to make the same mistakes. And I think there's a lot of history around this that I think we'd be wise to observe.
Absolutely right. And one more thing came out of the King's speech. This is the way of the government announcing its plans for the next period. And that was Keir Starmer's saying, or King Charles saying it on his behalf, my government are going to do everything in their power to get Ukraine into NATO.
Yeah, and as we've discussed before, I'm a bit nervous about that, because if you're going to negotiate some form of cessation of hostilities, one of the things that Russia's going to want is Ukraine not being a member of NATO.
Yeah.
So to take that off the table, I think is potentially dangerous. Before we wrap up today,
yes,
need to tell our audience we won't be back next week. One of the reasons is because one of us is taking a bit of a lasted break. In fact,
going on holiday.
Yeah, sort of holiday. Congratulations to Bern, though. Gets married on Saturday.
Thank you very much.
Massive congratulations, and enjoy the break. We'll look forward to a resumption of the Red Matrix podcast on your return.
Thank you very much. And you are going to be there, and you are going to be...
Yeah, master of ceremonies, shouting everybody around, so God knows how that's going to go. No, massive congratulations, Bern. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you very much.